And our next story comes from Wuhan, the city that gave us COVID-19. But this story is not about the virus. It's about the people of Wuhan. Have a look at these visuals. They are from Wednesday. They show hundreds of people scuffling with police officials in Wuhan. Why? To protest cuts in medical benefits. I'll explain that in a bit. First, you have to see these images. This protest was not an isolated incident. Have a look at these images now. They are from Wuhan's Zhongshan Park area. Thousands assembled here on Wednesday afternoon. They were seen singing the international anthem used in socialist movements across the world. Watch this. Interestingly, these protests are no longer restricted to Wuhan. They have now spilled over to a host of other cities, like Anshan. Have a look at these images. They show some residents of Anshan assembled outside a local government building, protesting against cuts in medical insurance. In the city of Dalian, we saw something similar. Thousands of people assembled outside a government building, chanting slogans against the regime and collectively singing the International. These visuals are striking, to say the least. They indicate a return of domestic unrest, a return of protests similar to what we saw last year. The question is, what sparked these demonstrations? And the answer is slightly long. To start with, these protests are against public health insurance reforms that were implemented earlier this month. These reforms include cuts in monthly allowances paid to retirees under China's public health insurance system. The changes were introduced to help local governments that are financially strained due to zero COVID policies. The central leadership has signaled that it will not bail out the local governments from their woes. So in return, the local governments are reducing the medical benefits to their people, especially the elderly. And this has sparked the current unrest. And let me remind you here, this unrest is not limited to a few hundred people. It involves tens of thousands of China's elderly. In fact, such is the scale of the protests that Wuhan had to shut some public institutions on Wednesday. Why? To prevent the protesters from damaging these institutions. And the protests are bad as it is. What's making them worse is the government's response. Reports say the unrest has been worsened by the fact that Chinese officials are largely unaffected by the changes. They still have access to generous medical treatments at the expense of the common man. And this is fueling the anger of the protesters. This is what a political risk consultancy firm had to say about this. Civil servants and public institution staff are still entitled to subsidized medical assistance insurance on top of the employee health insurance scheme. Senior and retired Chinese Communist Party cadres have long had access to generous medical treatments at public expense and without having to pay for basic healthcare insurance. Just to put this simply, China is giving its officials a free pass and giving the common man arbitrary cuts in health benefits. And this iniquity is making the people even angrier. Next question. Just how did things reach this point? What exactly is the reason behind such steps? A simple reason is China's overbearing debt. According to a Forbes report, China's overall debt, both in the public and the private sector, has risen to a colossal $51.9 trillion. This is almost 3 times the size of China's economy. And due to this massive debt distress, Chinese cities are struggling to pay their bills. They are slashing wages, cutting public services, and reducing the fuel subsidies. And why are the local governments in debt in the first place? Due to a host of reasons. The first one is exhausted budgets. Many local governments in China have completely drained their coffers by spending enormously on the lockdowns, the mass testing, the quarantine centers. This is a minefield of China's own making. Reason number 2 being lower revenue. As the Wuhan virus engulfed China last year, people reduced their spending to save money, and this resulted in less tax revenues by the local governments. Furthermore, huge tax breaks were given to support the ailing businesses. On to reason number 3, the most important of them all, the housing market slump. You see, home prices in China have been falling for 16 months straight. We have been telling you about this. Land sales, which account for 40% of all the local government revenue, also collapsed. These 3 reasons explain the debt crisis that China is currently in. They also explain the drastic steps the local governments have been forced to take, steps that have sparked the protests in Wuhan and other Chinese cities. The question is, could things get worse? Localized protests are not entirely rare in China, but the spate of demonstrations that we are seeing of late signal that COVID-19 restrictions have had a deep social impact. That they have, in a way, pushed people to such a desperate point where they no longer think twice before taking on the regime. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.